Does the presence of evil in our world prove that God does not exist? We'll find out today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. I have been traveling, and so we had a few unusual episodes, one of those done with Charles Lalonde about can the rich man be saved, as well as a few throwback episodes, but we are back. And you know what we have coming at you today? We have the much anticipated, much requested series on the problem of evil. So this is one of the problem of evil is one of the most well-known problems or anti-proofs for the existence of God, you know, in the history of philosophy. And so for those of you who are unaware, there are proofs for the existence of God, things like the cosmological argument, the ontological argument, the teleological argument, these various proofs, demonstrations that God exists. But then you also have these anti-proofs, right? These attempts to demonstrate that there is something about the nature of the world that proves or indicates to the contrary, that God does not exist. And there's several of these: the problem of pain, the problem of divine hiddenness, and then the sort of chief among these is the problem of evil. And in many ways, some of the other problems, like the problem of pain or the problem of divine hiddenness, which we already talked about on this show, those are considered sort of subsets, right? Sub-problems within the problem of evil. And so inevitably, when talking about the problem of evil here on this show, we will touch on those things, even though our focus is on the problem of evil. So what is that problem? Well, the sort of popularized version of it, the sort of thing that you hear, the colloquial version, if you will, would be, well, if God exists, then why is there suffering in the world? Or why do bad things happen to good people? Or some variation like that. And certainly this is a problem that I wouldn't want to diminish. I actually do take this problem very seriously. It's the sort of thing that I took very seriously in my own spiritual journey. And so if you actually look back on the episode where I shared my wild ride to orthodoxy, where I talked about my entire philosophical and religious journey, I actually talk about the significance of the problem of evil to my thinking and how it shaped how I thought about God and approached problems and things like that. So I took it very seriously. And even when I was opponent of Christianity and sort of toying with all sorts of wild-eyed philosophical heretical ideas, I focused heavily on the problem of evil. It was the focus of my master's thesis. And then my doctoral dissertation, I focused on Gottfried Leibniz, and specifically his Theodicy. So for those of you who have never heard that term, Theodicy is a defense of God, right? Theos and dike. It's these two Greek terms that come together, you know, justice and God. And basically it's a defense of the justness of God or the goodness of God in the face of evil. And this term is coined by Leibniz. And so in his essays on theodicy, that's where we get the term. And that's become sort of a catch-all term for the defenses of God, right? This theodicy. And so my doctoral dissertation was on Leibniz and the sort of historical influences in patristic and medieval thought on his thinking on this topic. And recently I just finished up an entire book on Leibniz, which is sort of the culmination of those years of research on that, arguing for a certain reading of him that's a little bit unusual, mainly because he's not typically read hand in hand with his sort of theological historical influences. He's often sort of treated just as a rationalist. And I think Leibniz is deeply, deeply indebted to both pagan and Christian tradition. Different topic. We actually will probably touch on this in this series. But when it comes to the problem of evil, I actually take it very seriously. I take it very seriously because I think it's an important guide in how to think about God and his relationship to the world and providence. And as we'll see when we go through this, the relationship between evil and God is actually critical to how Christian thinking generally has been shaped over the years. So it's not the sort of thing that should be treated lightly. It's not the sort of thing that should be easily sidelined. And so just on a personal level, I'll also just say the existential problem of evil, which is different than the logical problem, right? Sometimes philosophers will differentiate the analytic problem. Is there some sort of logical contradiction between both the presence of evil and the existence of God? That's the logical problem of evil. But then then there's sort of this existential problem of evil, which is when bad things happen, we naturally ask, why would God allow that? Why didn't he intervene? Where is he, right? Those sorts of existential problems. And I think those are very intuitive. I don't think they should be easily dismissed. I think it's extraordinarily human and reflexive to naturally wonder, God, if you're there, why are you so silent? God, if you are there, why did you let this happen? God, how could you let me go through this sort of thing? How could you permit this? Are you even causing this even? Those sorts of questions, those more existential questions that hit us on the ground level, I think are palpable questions that really have a lot of force to them. And so sometimes I think when dealing with these problems, there's a tendency to treat it very coldly and analytically and ignore sort of the very real existential side of it. And I'd hate to do that. It's one of the reasons I take the problem so seriously, because I'm attuned to the idea that somehow evil, the way it hits us, it tends to drive us toward those sorts of questions rather naturally. So I take this question very seriously. I've spent a lot of time with this question, with this problem. It has shaped my thinking significantly. And so I'm actually looking forward to sharing a lot of my thoughts with you on this topic. I will say this particular problem, right, the problem of evil, how many episodes are we going to do on this? Well, I will just say that my anticipation, here's the roadmap I expect. We'll see if it holds. The roadmap I expect is that we're going to do one problem today, right? One episode today on the problem of evil and talking about sort of the basic contours that are part of the most traditional defenses, consistent staples, if you will, of the sort of standard storehouse of replies to the problem of evil. And that'll be the focus of today. The next episode, I'm hoping to focus in on some of these more metaphysically robust areas of thinking that you see in people like Leibniz. I want to tackle what Leibniz has to say about our world. He actually, believe it or not, he actually tries to argue that our world is the best of all possible worlds, and we'll look at what that means and why he thinks that. But there's also these other aspects of the problem that come up when looking at, the thinking of somebody like Leibniz that I think are very important. So often there's a tendency to just focus on the evils of our world and not so much on the goods of our world. And a lot of what Leibniz has to say, and traditional Christian thought and traditional pagan thought has to say on this topic, really has a lot to say about the goodness of our world, which I think is actually just as significant and important to our thinking when we're approaching this topic as focusing on the evil. So some of those areas, right, from pagan thought and medieval thought and from Leibniz will occupy our second episode. And then the third episode is going to be the most unique. So as those of you who follow me or read me or are familiar with my podcast, you'll be familiar with the fact that I'm Eastern Orthodox. And a lot of my philosophical journey, right, these years and years of study of philosophy and religion eventually led me to Eastern Orthodoxy. And so oftentimes when I tackle a topic about divine hiddenness, a topic about freedom, a topic in theology or philosophy of religion, I'll oftentimes bring in sort of unusual insights from the Eastern Church Fathers. And I say unusual because most of philosophy of religion, here in an American context or an Anglophone context, is largely Western, right? We sort of grow out of the soil of the Enlightenment. We grow out of the soil of Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. And so as a result, a lot of our thinking is oftentimes hemmed in by those influences. And I think there's a tremendous number of insights that stand outside of that in figures like the Eastern Church Fathers who think very differently about a lot of topics, about religious epistemology, about providence, about God-world relations, and all the rest. And those who have looked at some of my scholarly work, you'll recognize that I have a tendency to do this odd thing where I take scholarship about a topic in Western thought, like the writings of Immanuel Kant, and I'll end up doing something very unusual, which is to put him in dialogue with insights from the Eastern Church Fathers. Not many people do that sort of thing. But I think it's very fruitful to take these contemporary problems in philosophy and religion, things that grow out of modernity, things that still circulate in the field of philosophy of religion, and oftentimes are sort of working with a set of possibilities and insights and things like that that are really sort of drawn just from Western soil, and bring into that a different perspective, a perspective from the Eastern Church Fathers. And if you've listened to my series on the problem of divine hiddenness, I did that quite a bit there. So I started started with the sort of standard run-of-the-mill philosophy of religion, sort of responses that you can find in a lot of different writers and thinkers, and then eventually drew out new insights, fresh insights that you typically wouldn't find in philosophy of religion, because I'm drawing on, again, Eastern patristic sources. So my plan is to do that here as well. And just by way of teaser, I'll just say the book I just finished up on Leibniz, it's coming out this year with Routledge. I do plan to do a second book specifically on the problem of evil in the Eastern Church Fathers. So that is something that is on the horizon, God willing, that I end up carving out time in order to write that book. But we'll get a preview of some of those insights here. And so I'm looking forward to sharing that. So like I said, I suspect that's 3 episodes. Will it be 3 episodes? Well, we shall see how it goes. With that, that's our roadmap. Let's jump on in. So let's start with the problem, right? What is the problem of evil? The most well-known formulation of this is actually David Hume's formulation. So Hume offers what he calls a summary of Epicurus, right? So Epicurus is a pre-Socratic philosopher, founder of one of the sort of key figures within the atomist movement. So the atomists were people who, exactly as it sounds like, they thought the world was composed of these little bits of matter called atoms, right? And Epicurus was one of these. He was also a hedonist. Some people suggest that he's an atheist. I actually think his writings indicate more of an agnosticism regarding the gods, but it doesn't matter. That was sort of a standard polemic against Epicurus in the ancient world. And so Epicurus is one of the first who supposedly formulated the problem of evil. The reason I say supposedly is because we don't actually have an original text from Epicurus. Like so many ancient sources, what we have is someone who quotes Epicurus. And so in this case, it's I believe it's Lactantius who preserves the statement of Epicurus on this. And there are some people who, based on other writings of Epicurus, question whether this is actually an accurate representation of something Epicurus said. Regardless, it doesn't matter. Somehow this passes through Lactantius's pen, and then it ends up in the mouth of David Hume, summarized as follows. Is God willing to prevent evil, but unable? Then he is impotent. Is he able, but unwilling? Then malevolent. Is he both willing and able? Whence then cometh evil, right? And that's the problem. It's basically suggesting, look, you've either got to say that God is capable of preventing evil, but he just doesn't want to, or you've got to say that he wants to, but he just can't, right? He can't prevent it. And Hume, of course, presumes that to take either horn of that dilemma is to embrace something that traditional theists have not typically wanted to say of God. The classical view of God, starting from, the more sort of pagan elevated view of God, as contrasted with the sort of Homeric gods. Once you get to people like Plato and you start to have a form of, highest being theology, right? Some sort of highest being that is God, you end up suggesting that God is omnibenevolent, that he is fully good, right? Or even is, in the case of Plato and then the Christians, the good, right? That in some ways goodness itself is somehow synonymous with God. And so that benevolence, that omnibenevolence, that all benevolence, all goodness, surely that's not something that the theist wants to abandon. So then you're left with omnipotence. But traditionally, the traditional view, certainly from the Christians, right, Judeo-Christianity has always held that God is omnipotent, right, that he is all-powerful. And in some ways, the pagans, many of the pagans, have always said the same thing in some form or other. And so when talking about this idea that God is omnibenevolent and also omnipotent, it seems that you're really sort of stuck with a problem that says, well, evil really shouldn't exist. But there is evil. So how do you get around that? That's the formulation of the problem of evil. And this has been sort of fleshed out in a variety of ways. As I said, it's been paired with problems like divine hiddenness. If God is so significant to our lives, what does this mean? Does he not make himself more evident? And obviously, I have a 3-part series on this podcast where you can listen to my thoughts on that topic. There's also these sort of sub-problems of the problem of pain and of suffering, problems of animal pain and suffering and things like that. And we'll touch on some of those here in the process. So those have been fleshed out. But that formulation by Hume, that's basically sort of like the core formulation that most people, when they raise the problem, they're addressing that. Now, when jumping into this and looking at this problem in the light of older literature, and by older, I mean like pre-Socratic literature or Socratic literature, right? The pagan sort of discussion and then on into the Christian discussion. What's interesting about this is that you see that the first question, which I think is really the right question to ask, is what is evil? Right. And so that's sort of a thing that oftentimes today people will just sort of jump over that part of the inquiry and just start with, it's obvious that evil is so. And yet in the ancients, they had to answer the question, well, what is it? Like, what are we really talking about? This thing, if one of the premises that evil is present in our world, then what is it? And really you see probably, let's just say for simplicity's sake, probably three answers, not solutions, answers to this question in the ancient writers. One of those answers is that evil really isn't some sort of transcendent moral rule of the kind that we tend to think of when we get into things like ethics or morality, or even into mythologies or into Christianity and religion and things like that. In other words, evil is just a word that we use to signify something that we find unpleasant. Okay, so this is the sort of thing that actually figures like Heraclitus you can find in him. He wants to suggest that we will sometimes use the word, man will sometimes use the word just and unjust, good and evil in reference to things that we find desirable and undesirable, pleasant and unpleasant. But if we could see everything from the vantage point of the logos, which is Heraclitus's idea of God, his term for the rational ordering principle of nature, then we'd see that all things are good and just and have their proper place and so on and so forth. In other words, the whole notion of something that is somehow out of order, disordered, or is not good in some ways as a result, Heraclitus wants to say, well, that's all an illusion. That term just signifies something like pain. We just mean something that's unpleasant and that we don't want to have happen. Now, this certainly does address the problem, right? Because in this sense, you're denying the premise, well, whence cometh evil? The answer is it doesn't. Right. And that is one way of doing it. One way of dealing with the problem is say there is no such thing as evil. When we use this word evil, we're talking about something, some non-entity, some phantasm of the mind that we use as a placeholder to refer to things that we don't like, that we think ought not to be. But there's really no basis for the thinking that those things ought not to be. And so one idea is that evil doesn't exist, that it's just an illusion, and it's just sort of a phantasm of human experience. That's one solution. Now, Heraclitus is not the only one who takes the position that evil is illusion. Heraclitus probably is some form of pantheist, believing that God and world are sort of some kind of organic wholes, organic unity. And pantheism has oftentimes had a tendency to treat evil as more of an illusion here on the sort of phenomenological level. The sort of thing that we as humans sort of name or identify as part of our experience. But in reality, if you could sort of step outside of that to sort of the God's eye view, you would see that it's not real. Certain forms of Hinduism, too, for example, hold this view. And so this is not uncommon, but that is one way of addressing the question of evil. What is it? It is not, right? It is an illusion brought on by human experience and us identifying what we don't like or think ought not to be, even though there's no grounding to that. That's one possibility. The other possibility says, like, no, like evil really is a substantial part of our experience of reality, of our world. And in this sense, it gives a very elevated sort of dualistic, what's called a metaphysical dualism. So dualism sometimes is used in reference to things like body-soul dualism, two substances. But in this case, metaphysical dualism is used to refer to two substances, one good and one evil, two principles that, sort of constitute our world. And you have a variety of forms of this. One version of this is basically a mythologized form. And this is the sort of thing you can find in Empedocles, where what you literally have is you have two deities, one who is good and one who is evil, and they're at war with each other. And so in Empedocles' narrative, he believes that all things are composed of the four elements. They come together, and as they come together in various ways, you start to get the diversity of the world. And then what erosion or corruption is basically where the elements start to separate and break down. And how he explains that is by two principles. One is a deity who he names love. And so he suggests that this sort of order and harmony is indicative of, well, love. That's why he calls the good deity that. And then on the other hand, what you have is you have a second principle that creates conflict, right? And this is strife. So this is the second deity, the evil deity that intervenes in the midst of that order and begins to break it down. And he proposes that there's this whole like cosmic cycle where the whole world itself goes through a movement from a primordial form to fully formed and then starts to return to that primordial form and start over again. And what is that? That's the perpetual war between love and strife. So that's the sort of thing you find in Empedocles. But you also find in people like Gnostics and the Manichaeists that sometimes this duality has to do with substances, a second principle, right? So sometimes here in this form of metaphysical dualism, the idea is that the good is something like spirit, right? Spirit is the good. And then matter, that is the thing that is evil and corruptive. And that's where what you end up having is you have, well, we ourselves are sort of in this inner conflict and we're a mixed bag of good and evil because we're mergers of spirit and of flesh, of matter and of spirit, of the good and of the evil. And that's the conflict that you see in our world, right? The mingling of these two principles. Now, even in some of those forms, you still have deities, right? The Gnostics had all sorts of deities involved, some who were good and some who were evil. And then also in Manichaeism, you also have deities, right? Good and evil. Augustine of Hippo talks about how when he was a Manichaeist, and he was for a time before he became a Christian, he thought about evil as like this malignant creeping mass that, sort of gropes throughout the world looking to wreak destruction on things and things like that. And so that's one way of doing it, is metaphysical dualism as well. Now, the third way is actually the Christian way. And the Christian way has always suggested that evil is actually not a substantive reality. That metaphysical dualism is wrong-headed in the sense that it actually suggests that evil is actually a thing. And in fact, evil is not a thing. It's only ever a privation or a corruption. Now, how does this work, right? The idea is pretty straightforward. The idea is that when you're talking about something like, let's take an eye, let's take a simple physical example, right? You have the concept that an eye, the structure and the harmony, the being, the intelligible traits of that, all of that is good, right? So those things identify the positive traits of it. And those positive traits, being is good, not necessarily morally good, but good in a sort of general sense, in an ontological sense. Moral good is sort of an additional property all its own, and we'll get to that. So there's an ontological goodness to that existence, to that structure, right, to that harmony and things like that. And the idea is that also when you look at the eye, it's pretty obvious that the ontology, right, the formal properties, what it is, tells you why it is, right? For what purpose you have eyes? Well, to see. And so anything that is moving the eye toward proper formation such that you can see is a movement into being, right? A movement toward the good of the eye. Now we contrast this, and let's say I scratch my eye and suddenly I have trouble seeing. Well, this becomes a physical evil, not a moral evil, right? It might be perpetrated by a moral evil. Somebody attacks me, out of, vengeance or something like that, and you might have moral traits. But we're just talking about just the scratch itself, right? That somehow harms my eye and makes it difficult to do its job. Well, this would be a physical evil. It would be an evil to the eye, meaning that somehow it hinders the ability for my eye to perform its function. Now, the thing is, blindness or, some sort of defect like that is not actually an additive property. It's actually a negation, a privation, a corruption of the thing. And this was always inherent to the nature of Christian thinking, that the presumption is that the order of reality, that beings themselves, that every being, everything that God makes is good. And when we're talking about evil, what we're talking about is some sort of twisting, right? Some sort of corruption, some sort of deprivation that is set in. And in this sense, you're talking about a negative reality, not a positive reality. And this is true on the physical level, right? The idea that evil, physical evils, as these are typically called, like blindness is considered a physical evil, is the sort of thing that you're talking about negations, right? Some sort of divergence from proper formation, something that is a hindrance to the thing becoming what it is made to be. But this is also true on the moral level. So, for example, let's consider the virtues, the contrast between virtue and vice. One of the things in classical, originally pagan thinking, in people like Plato, that then ended up echoed by the Christians, was the idea that vice is actually, again, it's not an additive property. It's a negation. So when Plato is asking the question, like, what is virtue? Or Socrates is asking the question, what is virtue? But when he's asking the question, like, what is virtue? This is the sort of thing that comes up in the Meno dialogue. He's basically saying, like, so what is virtue? And Meno in this dialogue ends up suggesting, well, I don't know, Socrates. Maybe the virtue of a father is one thing, and the virtue of a mother is another thing, and the virtue of a soldier is another thing. And Socrates says, well, yes. But, part of the question is, like, what makes them all virtues? So if they are all virtues, then there's something that they share in common. They are part of a common genus. They might be different species of virtue, but they have to have some commonality that runs through them that makes them all virtues. So what is that? And as Plato digs into this topic, or Socrates digs into this, I should probably explain. Socrates and Plato, obviously, like Plato, we don't have any of the writings of Socrates. Our only record of Socrates is, the dialogues that are recorded by Plato. Most do grant that Socrates is a real guy, but where exactly Socrates ends and Plato begins, where these are real dialogues true to Socrates' philosophy, and where it's Plato offering his own thoughts, is difficult to tell. Aristotle, the student of Plato, does believe that there is a difference between the philosophy of Socrates and Plato, but again, it makes it difficult to suss out. Okay, aside over. Jumping back to the whole other topic. Okay, so when dealing with this topic, right? Okay, so what is it? What is the essential trait of virtue? What makes virtue? One of the things you end up coming to is that with Plato, you really see the notion that the virtues are one, and that in many ways justice becomes sort of the central trait that runs through all the virtues. So in classical pagan thinking, there's really sort of four primary virtues. The idea of justice, right? The idea that you render to each its due. The idea of temperance, right? Or self-control. The idea of wisdom, right? Or prudence. And then the idea of courage, right? So those are the sort of four chief pagan virtues. And the idea was that if you have only one of these virtues or only two of these virtues, right? If you have lopsided virtues, you end up getting vice of some kind. So for example, courage, right? Let's say, you laugh in the face of danger, right? But the problem is you also, for that reason, you lack wisdom. And so when it comes to choosing the best course of action, you're bullheaded and foolish. Well, now your courage is actually a vice, right? Because it's no longer true courage, because it lacks wisdom, because it lacks self-restraint paired with wisdom. Now you're just sort of a bullheaded fool who causes problems. Similarly, right? When we look back at certain times where we're like, well, they elevate temperance, but it seems that they elevate temperance in a way that is actually prudish, right? Where they're depriving certain goods of their appropriate due. Well, that's actually a lack of justice, right? So justice, you render to each its due, and so on. So anyway, the point is to say that when it comes to the pagan virtues, you always have sort of this concern that says you need all of the virtues in order to have true virtue. If you end up having just some of the virtues, then you end up in this lopsided situation where you actually land in vice. Now, the importance of that, again, going to the Christian point about evil being a privation, is that vicious behavior, vicious disposition is actually not an additive trait. It's reflective of a lack, right? It's a lack of temperance, or it's a lack of justice, or it's a lack of prudence, right? That sort of thing. Now, the point of all this, the reason that the Christians lean in this direction is that they actually want to suggest, it's critical that they suggest in defense of the goodness of God, that God does not create evil. And so this is one of the things that you see happen. Augustine's Confessions is a good example of this sort of thing, because Augustine in his early years, as I mentioned, was toying with Manichaeism, which is a form of metaphysical dualism. And so he thought of evil as a substantial principle, as a second principle. But of course, he was troubled by the idea, if God is really sort of the first principle and the source of all things, then this thing would have to originate from him. And then in that case, that's an indictment of the goodness of God. So that was always a concern for the Christians to say, if you end up suggesting that evil is somehow substantial, right, that it's actually a substance, it's a thing that exists, then you either have to create a second God that exists completely independent of God, or you have to suggest that God is the creator of evil, which is an indictment of his goodness, which they obviously weren't going to do. So these are sort of the early, this is the early trichotomy, right? Are you going to suggest that evil is an illusion and that it doesn't exist, and that's how you solve the problem? Is it that you're going to suggest that there is some sort of metaphysical dualism, be it, two gods that are at war with each other, or two principles? Platonism does this, for example. It presumes that evil is sort of a natural byproduct of the inherent instability of matter and its inability to perfectly replicate God's ideas. So, in Platonism, God does not create matter. And so matter just inherently introduces these corruptions and these instabilities and things like that. So you can blame it on a second principle. You have God and then a second principle like matter, or you have a second deity like in Empedocles. Or do you suggest that all things originate from God and in their original form, this is the Judeo-Christian narrative, are good? But somehow there's some principle within the world, internal to the world, that is originally good, that is capable of somehow twisting it and corrupting it. Now, I suspect you can already guess what that principle is going to be. And that principle is going to be free will. Now, we're going to zero in on that because obviously that's one of the staples of the Judeo-Christian answer to the problem of evil. Christian philosophy especially has spent a great deal of time devoted to the free will defense because it suggests that free will is actually a good, right? It's actually a positive power, a positive feature of reality, but it's a double-edged sword, something that can actually introduce corruption and ultimately evil into the world. And so that becomes the Christian solution, right? That the things that God makes are originally good, but internal to those things is the capacity of twisting them, right, contrary to the will of God, and introducing corruption, privation, and ultimately evil. Now, obviously, as somebody who is an Eastern Orthodox Christian, I gravitate toward the third of these solutions. And let me just say a couple of things about why I think that actually is the obvious choice. Maybe I shouldn't say it's obvious, but at least why I think it's the best or the most rational choice. I'll give a couple of reasons here. Let's start with the possibility that evil is an illusion. This, I actually think, is the sort of thing that you would have to say if you are an atheist, right? So if you're talking about the atheist worldview, where somehow our world really doesn't originate from something like a mind, that the notions of, order and purpose, of justice and injustice, of fairness and unfairness, are really sort of mental inventions that are projected on reality backwards after minds happen to emerge out of the sort of chaos of the world, then what you're actually suggesting is that all of the notions about justice and injustice, right and wrong, good and evil, fairness and unfairness that drive the problem forward are all mental fictions of our own invention. In which case, the key premise of the argument, evil exists, or evil is part of our world, or something like that, is undermined by this worldview. And so that's where what I see as really incoherent, I see it as ultimately incoherent whenever an atheist wants to advocate for the argument and then say that what the argument drives you toward is the conclusion that God doesn't exist, because what you end up with is what is, a situation where you have self-referential incoherence, where your key premise for establishing your atheism is something that your atheism has to also reject. And so in this sense, I'm very sympathetic to the atheist because I think, look, the problem is very serious and should be taken into account when assessing the world. But the problem is the conclusion at which the atheist arrives cannot be supported by the argument itself. If one of your key premises is that evil is real, that it is a very genuine and real feature of our world, then atheism is not one of the conclusions. You need some form of theism or pantheism or something in order to support the idea that there actually are real structures of our world that include purpose, that include justice, that include injustice, that includes fairness, unfairness, good and evil, and all the rest. And so the atheist conclusion, I don't think, is viable. And for that reason, any sort of approach that ultimately makes evil an illusion I think ends up in this sort of self-referential incoherence. And so I'm not sympathetic to that one because I really do believe that evil is a real feature of reality, that it's a feature of reality. And why do I think that, right? This is something that I don't want to belabor, but if you go to, say, my case for realism, there's an episode where I talk about realism and nominalism, something that we'll also touch on here because we always touch on it. But I also did an entire episode where I made my case for realism. And in there, as well as other places, I've talked about my disposition toward properly functioning faculties arguments. I'm not a hard foundationalist. I'm not somebody who, with Rene Descartes or somebody like that, would want to say, well, let's doubt everything and then we only believe the things that, that we have irrefutable airtight proofs for, and then we start to build our house on those proofs. That sort of hard foundationalist approach where you start to build brick by brick this, unimpeachable worldview, I think is problematic. In fact, I think it's ultimately incoherent, because one of the things you'll inevitably do along the way is employ things like logic and trust your faculties, which are rather large premises if you're really going to engage in a skeptical enterprise. And so I think the only coherent way to move forward epistemologically, discerning how do we know that we know that we know, I think the only thing that you can really do coherently is you can start by trusting your faculties and presume that your faculties are functioning properly and that they're aimed at truth telling, and that, in that sense, that's sort of your step one. So that sort of soft foundationalist, reliable, properly functioning faculties approach to epistemology is something that I'm always inclined toward. I think that's the best way forward in terms of epistemology. Now, the reason that's important is because one of the things that all of us intuitively recognize and can't shake is morality. And so even the person who wants to sit here and engage in some sort of enterprise where they start to say, no, it's all an illusion. Right and wrong, good and evil, justice, injustice, these are sort of mental fabrications. At some point, they are going to gripe and piss and moan about how somebody slighted them. They're going to cry injustice or unfairness about something. It doesn't take very long for that moral faculty to kick in. And so they can always sort of reflexively try to be like, oh, wait. Yeah, I'm not supposed to think that, right? And they can try to retroactively undo it. But that is the default setting of the human mind. And so if you're starting with the idea that the mind is aimed at truth telling, that its sort of innate structures are when properly functioning, are aimed at telling us true things about the world, then morality is certainly on the list of things that it tries to tell us about the world, that good and evil, right and wrong, justice and injustice are part of the world. I always find it fascinating, the idea that whenever something goes awry, one of the questions is why, right? Why would this happen? And there's this notion that somehow the world ought to be just, which is a really wild notion if, you don't think there is any such thing as justice. Where does this notion come from? The idea that things ought to be fair, or they ought to be just. Where does that notion come from? And it's additionally odd when you consider the fact that our world clearly is not just, at least in the here and now. Obviously, part of the narrative of religion is that it ultimately will be just, right? That there is some righting of things in the ultimate scheme of things. But right now, in the here and now, we don't experience justice or fairness. So the question would be, if justice and fairness are chimeras that we don't experience and aren't part of the fabric of the world, why is that everybody expects that the world ought to be that way? It's a rather sort of odd phenomenon, if you think that. But if you think your faculties are actually aimed at telling you true things about the world, then it's not odd at all. Because what it tells you is that your mind knows something about the world, namely that it ought to be fair and just. And then maybe we should consider, well, why is that? And will it ultimately prove to be that way at some point? So anyway, all that's to say is that as somebody who's an advocate of this sort of like soft foundationalist, properly functioning faculty stuff, I have a tendency to say, look, I'm not going to dismiss evil as an illusion, because it would be an indictment of my faculties and everyone else's faculties, suggesting that we have some sort of, malfunction that is ubiquitous to humanity, namely that there is such a thing as right and wrong, good and evil, justice, injustice, fairness and unfairness. And so for that reason, I have to treat evil as, something of significance, a feature of reality. But then you're left with, okay, so why not go with metaphysical dualism? If you think it's really that substantial and such a feature of reality as that, then, why not just embrace that solution, Dr. Jacobs? And here I think somebody like C.S. Lewis actually offers a rather compelling case in his Mere Christianity. So Lewis talks about in Mere Christianity how when he first became a Christian, one of the things that struck him was how much like metaphysical dualism Christianity is. Now, Lewis talks about, keep in mind, he's a medievalist, right? So he deals in these sorts of like ancient and medieval waters all the time. He's very familiar with metaphysical dualism, and he refers to it as metaphysical dualism. He always thought was the manliest of the philosophies. I always like that. That's great. The manliest of the philosophies, right? It seems very manly that there's a, there's a war that we're in the midst of between good and evil, this perpetual conflict. And Lewis points out that when he read the New Testament for the first time, he was shocked how much like good and like metaphysical dualism was. Why? Well, because there's all these demons. There's this talk of the devil, and he seems to be at war with God. And there's some sort of conflict between the Son of God who shows up on the scene and these demonic powers. And so Lewis looked at it and was like, man, it's a lot like metaphysical dualism. And yet he recognized that the key distinction between Christianity and the other forms of metaphysical dualism is that Christianity believes the world is originally good, and that there's something about that, there's a principle within that goodness, namely the will, that is capable of twisting it from within. Again, we'll get back to that. And Lewis makes an interesting point about one of the inherent problems with metaphysical dualism. One of the things that he points out, which is something that you see time and again in Christianity, is that nobody embraces evil for evil's sake, right? We don't embrace doing something, that is evil because we're like, it's evil, I delight in evil. It's normally because it's attached to some sort of good. It may be the pleasure that's attached to the thing that we think is more desirable than moral uprightness. Or it's even when we're engaged in sort of lording something over other people, maybe it's the power of lording it over them. In other words, there's something in the act that strikes us as desirable and good that is the thing that impels us to grab hold of it. Now, the reason Lewis thinks this is important is because if we imagine that we have two deities, right? We have one good and one evil. What we have is we have two different value sets. One is saying like, I want to do these sorts of things because I think they are desirable and good. And the other one says, I want to behave in the opposite way because I think the opposite is desirable and good. And when we say that one is good and one is evil, we're either saying that we happen to agree with the one, we like what you like, and we dislike what you like, in which case we're not actually saying there is real good and evil. We're just talking about preference. Or alternatively, we're saying there is some principle that is over both of them, that judges both of them, that says this one is correct and this one is incorrect. This one is right and this one is wrong. In other words, there has to be an order to the universe. And whatever that higher principle is that judges and adjudicates between the two of them, that would be the real God. So what Lewis thinks is, what he argues, and I think he's quite right, is that what metaphysical dualism itself starts to reveal is that there actually has to be a first principle of goodness adjudicating between good and evil. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the ontological principle, the substantial principle of all things is goodness. And then when you're talking about evil, you're talking about some sort of twisting or corruption. It's some sort of myopic or distorted picture of the good. So this is the sort of thing you see, for example, in somebody like Basil of Caesarea. There's one of his treatises where he's asked, how do we learn to love God? Teach us to love God. And he says, I don't need to teach you to love God. You already do love God. And that might sound really weird, like, what do you mean? Surely not everybody loves God. But Basil actually says, yes, everybody does love God. And what does he mean by that? Well, what he means is he's echoing a very traditional notion that you find in, early writers like pagan writers like Plato, and then echoes in the Christians, which is the idea that all of the particular goods around us, whether you're talking about pleasure, or you're talking about power, or you're talking about ontological goods, such as structure or order or harmony or all these sorts of things, that basically all of these are refractions of the good, right? This sort of transcendent goodness in which all the goods are unified. And the idea is that whenever you embrace a thing, right, whenever you embrace it because you identify some good in it. It could be pleasure, it could be power, it could be fun, it could be humor, whatever it is. You identify some sort of good that draws you to it, and that's why you pick it. The problem is not your desires. Your desires actually are directed toward the good. The problem is that we oftentimes fail to recognize that that small refraction of goodness has its source in God. And that when all of your desires are directed toward God, then what you start to get is the properly ordered set of desires. So think, for example, of what I said about virtue and the whole idea that when you have lopsided virtues, you get vice. For example, there's a lot of people in our culture today who celebrate courage, right? The courage to be you and self-actualization, all this sort of stuff. But the problem is that courage is oftentimes, and courage is good, right? There's something that's true about that, right? There's something that is a good thing that is being recognized. But the problem is it's lopsided. And it's lopsided in the sense that it might lack temperance, or it might lack wisdom, or it might lack justice, right? So it fails to render to each its due. It fails to choose the best course of action in accord with the order of nature. It fails to exercise restraint and then just becomes sort of an unrestrained pursuit of a particular good at the expense of all other goods. And now what you have is you have vice. And that's Basil's point, is that whenever we do a thing, we embrace the thing because we recognize some good within it. And that good is real, right? We're always doing things because of the good, but there is a proper ordering of particular goods. And that difference between properly ordered goods and disordered goods is where you get the difference between, good and evil. Now, the reason this is important is because this goes to Lewis's point. What Lewis's point is ultimately saying, like, look, if we have two deities, one who is good and one who is evil, let's say that, the one who is evil, he's driven entirely by power, right? Well, power actually is a good. But if it lacks temperance, if it lacks justice, right? Maybe it's this desire for power paired with complete unabandoned courage, right? But it lacks temperance, it lacks wisdom, it lacks justice. Then all of a sudden what you get is a vice. And that's Lewis's point, is that nobody's doing evil for evil's sake. And so ultimately, when you're talking about this principle that is over both, that is saying this one is right and this one is wrong, this one is just and this one is unjust, this one is rightly ordered and this one is disordered, that principle, you're really talking about the true God. And that ultimately does become the sort of Christian view of it, which is to say that the entire cosmos is composed of goods, and those goods have a proper order. But when they are distorted, when they are corrupted, when they are twisted, now you get some sort of shadow reality. Now you get what we call evil. And I think Lewis is quite right that to actually formulate in a cogent way metaphysical dualism is problematic. And so for this reason, I think the Christian answer ultimately is the best answer. But of course, the Christian answer is what lands us in the very problem that Hume is raising. Once we grant the divine attributes, if we say that God is good and we say that God is omnipotent, then shouldn't it be that we end up with a perfect world? Because wouldn't a God of that kind both desire and be capable of preventing evil? Now, remember that I had pointed out that there's a dichotomy here, right? Hume wants to suggest that you've got to either sacrifice, omnipotence, God is not capable of preventing evil, or you have to sacrifice omnibenevolence, that God doesn't want to, right? He's not really fully good. And I touched on this point in the, or you have to, I suppose you could, abandon evil, and that would be the illusion one. But if you're going to grant evil and, that it has some place in our world, then you're left with, well, which of these divine attributes do you want to sacrifice? These sorts of problems, right, these anti-proofs, things like the problem of divine hiddenness, they always actually are moral indictments of God, right? So in the problem of divine hiddenness, God ought to do this or do that. And so it is here with the problem of evil. God ought to. And so one of the things that I've always pointed out about morality, when I talk about free will, for example, is that there's really sort of two conditions under which moral culpability adheres. the knowledge of what you ought to do and the ability to do it or not do it. And this is sort of thing that all of us intuitively know, right? Children, we come out of the womb, right? The second we get caught doing something wrong, we either resort to, well, we might lie and try to, make sure that nobody knows that we did it. But if we're caught red-handed, the tendency is either to say, I didn't know, right, and claim ignorance, or I couldn't help it. Right, that somehow there were mitigating circumstances that forced my hand. And even when we're adults, the answers, they get more sophisticated, they get more complicated, but they're still, I didn't know or I couldn't help it. And so intuitively, we recognize that those are the conditions of moral culpability. And the church fathers recognize this. So they will frequently talk about that praise and blame towards somebody, moral responsibility, presumes that you know what you ought to do and you have the ability to do it or not do it. Now, the relevance of that is that when you're talking about a moral indictment of God, unless you're just going to say, well, he's God and shut up, right? But if you're going to actually make a case that God is not morally indictable, then you're going to have to claim either that God doesn't know, which is a tough sell, given that he is omniscient, or you're going to say that he couldn't help it, right? That there is some sort of, he couldn't prevent it or something like that. And what's interesting, and this is uncomfortable for a lot of people, but what is interesting is that Christianity has always opted for qualified omnipotence, choosing the horn of the dilemma that says that God can't prevent evil. Now, I know that there's probably going to be a visceral or immediate reaction for a lot of people that would say, like, what are you talking about? Like, God's omnipotent. He can do anything. And so, like, that's blasphemous. It's crazy. You can't say that sort of thing. And this is where it's important to understand what the traditional concept of omniscience, not omniscience, that would be all-knowing, omnipotence, what it really is. Omnipotence, historically speaking, has not, in traditional Christian views, pre-medieval views, late medievalism, this gets contested by people like William of Ockham. But before that, the traditional Christian view was always that God can do anything, but not everything we imagine or utter is a thing. And that's the key concept. So this goes into the territory of realism. I already touched on the concept of realism and nominalism. And here we go, right? For listeners who watch this show regularly, you're very familiar with the distinction between realism and nominalism because it comes up all the time. If you haven't watched The Most Important Question, that would be one to watch or listen to, where I sort of kick that off. And then I also have The Case for Realism, where I make, my case for why you should be a realist. But the basic idea of realism is this. The entire dispute hangs on the recognition that when we look out into the world, we, you, me, every other human, we automatically begin to think in terms of groups. We start to think in terms of these structures of genera, right? Animal, species, human, common properties, bipedal, things like that. And part of the question is, given that we do that, the question is, well, why does the mind do that? What are we doing, right, when we do that sort of thing? Is the mind identifying structures that are really out there? They are out there somehow. They are part of the world, right? They're not mental fictions or inventions of the mind, that somehow the world really is ordered in this way. And what's happening is the mind is recognizing that, and it's abstracting that. And it's just calling out the structures that it identifies that are really part of the nature of reality. If you say that, then you're a realist, right? Because you're saying those structures, right? Those general nouns, the structure, that order, all that is real. Now, the alternative is nominalism, where what you suggest is look, outside of the mind, if we could step outside of our mind, what we'd see is it's all just sort of like random, homogeneous matter in motion, colliding, whatever. And there isn't really any orderly structure to it, like the structures of genera and species, those sorts of things that we organize things with. Those are really just sort of mental fictions. The mind can't really cope with just sort of disorganized, infinite, individuated stuff. And so it needs to sort of group things. And so it invents these categories, it invents these groups, and then it begins to, basically impose these names on the world, right? These are just a bunch of names. These mental fictions, these invented groups are just social conventions and just names that we project out there on the world. And that's why it's called nominalism from the Latin nomen, right, for name, right? So these are just names that you invent. So if you say that, then you're nominalist. And Christianity has historically always been realist, and I am also a realist, and you can see why. You can actually, if you're interested in how I journeyed from being sort of an empiricist nominalist to being a hard-bitten realist, you could listen to my Wild Ride to Orthodoxy episode, which I'm sure we'll link to. But as I've also pointed out, Christianity has historically actually been realist. And it's not just realist in the way that it happens to be a realist, like, oh, it happens to be realist, but it could have been nominalist. It actually is, historically speaking, it's dogmatically realist. Like, it's an important part of Christian doctrine. And I've published about this a lot with regard to like the Arian dispute in particular. I won't go through the details here because, you know, the proof of that is less important to the point I'm looking to make. But suffice it to say that within the Arian dispute, one of the first big ecumenical, disputes of the Christian church, it becomes very apparent that the church fathers are realists, and that they believe their realist commitments are not just useful. They think they are Christian. They're part of the faith that has been handed down and that they've been received, that has been received from the dawn of the church. And those realist commitments are ultimately things that end up codified in things like the Nicene Creed, right? So these ecumenical councils that start to flesh out the Christian view of the Trinity and of Christology and things like that over the course of these ecumenical councils, the 7 ecumenical councils of the first millennium. If you're unfamiliar with that, well, they're what they sound like. The entire Christian church, while it's still a unified church, is sort of getting together and adjudicating the question of what did we receive. And that only happens 7 times in the first millennium. What you end up having is these declarations that are very clearly committed to realism as integral to the Christian worldview, as integral to the Christian faith. And so truthfully, I don't think there's any way of affirming historical Christianity without also affirming realism. And it's only in late medieval scholasticism that you get sort of people like William of Ockham, piously sort of chafing against this realist thing, because realists ultimately do say certain things that, like, well, God can't create square circles. And we'll get back to that in a second. But in sort of a rebellion against that, there was this sort of pietistic tendency to say, well, like, no, maybe that's not true, right? That somehow these logical structures are just, their logic is just something that is a human invention, and it's down here for us. But God transcends that, and so God can, right? And they really tried to kick off, right? Sort of cast off these shackles of realism that might somehow hinder God. And then in modernity, you ended up having a lot more folks like that, people like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, who had nominalist tendencies. But historical Christianity had always been realist. And so the historical confessional view of Christianity had always said, like, when we say that God can do anything, we're not saying that any sort of gobbledygook nonsense that you might throw together, any word combination that might come out of your mouth, is something that God can do. Now, why is this, right? Well, the reason is this, because for the realists, because they believe that structures of reality, right, these common groups, these structures, things like that logic itself, things like logic and mathematics, these things have their grounding in God, that God is inherently a rational being. The presumption is that logic is not just an invention, right? It is part of the fabric of reality. And so when you're talking about, what God can and can't do, there is a certain logical Leibniz test to it. So part of the problem is that let's just say we wanted to suggest that God can make a square circle, right? What are we really saying here? And the answer is what we've said well, God can make a 2-dimensional geometric shape with a flowing circumference on which all points are an equal distance from a common century, and yet which it doesn't have a flowing circumference, and all points are not an equal distance from a common century because it also has 4 sides, and the 4 sides are of equal length. Okay, all of those words taken alone are meaningful, but the combination is nonsense. Right? It's just gobbledygook. And as C.S. Lewis points out, nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk it of God. Let's think about it a different way. Basically, what the realists had always said about God is that before you can answer the question, can God do X, you have to offer X. In other words, in order to make a proposal that God could do something, you have to first propose something. And incoherent word combinations aren't something. They're nonsense. They're just word salad nonsense. And so, in other words, the realists wanted to suggest that the bar for possibility is much higher than we tend to think, right? We very casually say, like, of course God could, and then we fill in the blank. And one of the difficulties we run into is that sometimes when we begin to scrutinize those ideas, it starts to become apparent that those ideas are not really well-formed ideas. They might be filled with all sorts of, well, nonsense. And so the traditional Christian view has always been qualified omnipotence. Yes, God can do anything, but nonsense is not a thing. Nonsensical word combinations are not things. Contradictions are not things. And this is really important because this goes to these sorts of things that are relevant to the problem of evil. Because when talking about whether or not God is morally indictable for not preventing evil, one of the questions is, could he have prevented evil? Now, there's also the question, like, should he have prevented evil? And that's actually like closely related to the question of can he, but it is a distinct question. But, going to the moral indictment, right? The question that says, like, God could have prevented evil, that's one of the key premises, that if he is omnipotent, then he could have prevented evil. Well, that is part of the question. And it's one of the questions that it's one of the premises that presumes that, of course, God could prevent evil. That is the point, the premise that the majority of Christian defenses of God actually begin to attack. At least they start there for all intents and purposes. So there's really sort of three prongs here to what I would suggest are three main prongs or staples of the traditional Christian response to the problem of evil. And the first of these is the most well-known, and it's, of course, the free will defense. And the free will defense goes to this entire point about qualified omnipotence, where it's really suggesting, well, hey, God, not even God can make free creatures that are not free, or free creatures that are not self-determining, something like that. And so it's going to this sort of this claim that suggests that God is morally indictable because obviously he could make our world and prevent sin, but part of the question is that true? And the free will defense calls that into question. So let's start there because that's one of the most common features of the traditional, Christian defense of God in the face of evil. Now, the early forms of the defense are really just as basic as what I just said, right? The idea being that all that God has made is good, but one of the things that God has made is rational beings with free will. And having free will, they are self-determining beings, and therefore not even God can make self-determining beings who he determines to do good, right? In other words, they recognize that there's some sort of inherent contradiction here. And you get more sophisticated forms of this as it develops. But just to pause there for a second, that really is sort of the earliest notion of free will that you find amongst the pagans and amongst the Christians is this idea that, in the Greek, like the term oftentimes used in terms of free will is basically would translate more or less to self-substancing, right? Something that is like out of the authority of its own substance. It sort of like generates itself. So this sort of self-substancing or self-determination is the entire concept of what it means to be a rational, free being. And this is one of the reasons why one of the phrases that appears in the pagans and sometimes echoes in certain church fathers is it refers to the things that depend upon us. In other words, God makes an entire cosmos and he makes it good. And amongst the goods are rational beings who have reason and free self-determination. But that higher power, right, that power of self-determination is a double-edged sword because what it is, right, what it is by nature is something that is self-substancing, something that where part of the world is entrusted to us. And for that reason, we can go in directions that God would not have us go. Yes, God is that principle, right? That first principle that orders all things, that determines what the good is, that structures all things, that makes us aware of the way we should go, both from the testimony of nature and then ultimately, if you're talking about in the Christian narrative, through his own commandments and his direction. But ultimately, we as self-substancing beings, right, free beings, are ultimately the sorts of beings who have to actually choose to move in that direction. Now, I just have to say, I have a very lengthy episode on free will, and you can look at that one if you want to look more at the topic of free will in general. And I've got another sort of like letter on free will that you can also see. That's the shorter episode. But I will just say, this is something that is very odd about rational beings. And I think it's something we sort of fail to appreciate. And that's one of the reasons I always like to pause and sort of like think about this fact. You know, very few things, forget very few, nothing other than rational beings do this, right? So you never have bees going around being reflective about, you know, what am I? Well, I'm a bee. For what purpose do I have this stinger? Or do I have these wings? That's interesting. And do I want to engage in that purpose? Or do I want to move contrary to it? Like nothing else in all of nature does that. It just sort of does what it is made to do. It naturally develops and moves in accord with its nature. Whereas rational beings have this very bizarre capacity where we're able to actually look out at the order of nature, discern the rational order of nature, the rational order that emerges from the divine mind. And with that, actually engage in the sort of reflection that says, well, you know, what is the purpose of an eye? Well, it is to see, right? What is the purpose of my stomach for digestion, right? These sorts of things. We're able to actually look at the order of nature and recognize not only the nature, but the intended purpose, the teleology of the thing, and even engage in those sorts of reflections about us. What is the nature of man? What is it that sets us apart from the other things? How ought we to live? And discern things like morality. And then after discerning all that, right, after we being these sort of small images of the divine mind, being able to discern the patterns from the divine mind, we actually have the capacity to sit here and say, well, do I want to do that or not? And that's really weird. Like nothing else in nature does that. Nothing else in nature sits here and reflects on the order of nature and then decides for itself whether it wants to do it. But that's the nature of rational beings. That's actually what we do. And this is one of the reasons why the pagans referred to that as the part of the world that relies on us, the things that rely upon us, because we are the sole self-substancing, you know, sort of self-determining beings that God created. Now, the privative forms of the sort of like free will defense is actually it, you know, you find a couple of different components to it, both of which are suggesting that somehow a metaphysical necessity, it's just inherent to the nature of rational free beings that they cannot be determined by God. And this is, of course, addressing the indictment that says, well, God should just make free beings and then also make sure that they only do good things. So Augustine actually points this out. There is in I believe it's in book 5 of the City of God, where he's dealing with Cicero, and he's dealing specifically with Cicero's worry about foreknowledge and whether foreknowledge somehow undermines free will. And he's specifically worried about divination because he's dealing with pagans who believe in oracles and fate and things like that. And so he's concerned with that. So that's a context in which Augustine's dealing with this. But one of the things that he talks about is he talks about volitional causes. And he suggests that basically when you're talking about volitional causes, right, things that are free and self-determining, you land in the sort of contradiction you run into when you say like a square that's not a square, right? When you say a self-determining being, right, a will that is not self-determining. So if you want to suggest that we have a will that is determined by someone else, right? It's not self-determining. Then you've landed in the same sort of nonsense you land into when you say a square that doesn't have 4 sides or something like that. And so, in other words, Augustine is leveling the sort of realist case that suggests that not even God can make a will that is not self-determining. It's just essential to the nature of the thing. Now, a second feature that emerges on our sort of archaic metaphysical side of the free will defense is one that we'll spend a lot more time on when we get to the Eastern Church Fathers, because it's pretty unique to them. But nonetheless, I want to touch on it here because I think it's an important part of the early sort of Christian notions of free will. And that is that in the Arian Dispute, this first major ecumenical dispute of the Christian church, you end up getting, because the dispute is about the question of whether or not the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, is actually divine or whether he's a creature. And for that reason, because that's the nature of the discussion, what you end up getting is a very clear distinction between what makes a creature and God God. And so that distinction between God and creatures comes into sharp relief in that discussion. And one important feature of it is that the hallmark of creatures is that we come to be, right? And so one of the things that you see is they suggest that, well, when you're talking about a creature, you're talking about a possible being, right? God could make unicorns. And then you look around and they don't exist. And then God, by the word of his power, ends up drawing those things from a possible being into a concrete, real being, right? This movement from a potential thing to an actual thing, from potential to real, right? That's that transition into reality, the fact that it moves from non-being into being, or from potential to actual, or from possible to real, like however you want to phrase it, that transition is the thing that gets you a creature. That is the hallmark of creatureliness. Now, the reason that's important is because one of the things that comes out in this discussion is that it is an indispensable or essential trait of metaphysical necessity. Every creature is mutable. We undergo change or transition, right? We move from one primordial state into a concrete state. Now, the reason this is significant is because within this concept of creatureliness, which is inherent to Christianity, is the idea that not even God can make immutable creatures. Now, why is that significant? Well, it's significant for a couple of reasons. The one reason it's significant is because it actually suggests that one of the features of mutation is that we're capable of change, not only for good, but also for worse. In other words, anything that can move into being can retreat from being, right? That was the idea. You and I do not exist necessarily, right? We transition into existence, and for that reason, because existence is an accidental trait to us, we can also retreat from existence. Now, why is that important? Well, think back on what we said about the nature of evil. What is evil? Well, evil is a corruption, right? It is a twisting of reality. It is not a substantial thing. Well, what that means is if what a creature is something that can move into being and can retreat from being, that means that it is indispensable to the concept of a creature that it is corruptible. Meaning, being a creature, it is possible for you to retreat from being, which is a form of corruption. It's possible for you to fail to reach your proper end and be properly formed, which is a corruption. In other words, what comes out in this discussion is the commitment to the idea that not even God can make an incorruptible, immutable, fully formed, perfect creature. That every creature has of metaphysical necessity the trait that it can be corrupted. And not even God can make it otherwise. And that comes out really clear in the Arian Dispute. Again, I'll spend more time on this when I get to the third of these talks, when I'm talking about the Eastern Fathers. But in this episode, we're just going to sort of let that suffice. And so when you bring these two things together, you actually have a really strong case, granting these metaphysics, for the concept that yeah, God can't make creatures and guarantee that they do good. Why? Because to make a creature is to make something that is mutable and therefore corruptible, right? And corruption is what is meant by evil within the Christian context. So on the one hand, not even God can make a creature that is immune to the possibility of evil, immune to corruption. And then also with that, because when you're talking about rational beings, you're talking about beings that are inherently self-determining. Now you also can't strip from that corruptible being the act of self-determination. It's essential to the very concept that it must self-determine. And so in this sense, whether it's corrupted, right, it's a metaphysical necessity corruptible, And whether or not it becomes corrupt rests in its own hands because it's a self-determining being. And right there you have your explanation. Why doesn't God do this thing that we suggest he should, make creatures who are incorruptible? Well, the answer is because creatures are inherently of metaphysical necessity, and not even God can make it otherwise, corruptible. And when you're talking about rational beings, that corruption is in their own hands because they are self-determining beings. Now, that's the sort of archaic case of it. And I don't mean archaic in order to say like it's bad. I actually think that's the strongest form of it. I think that's actually a great case. But, what starts to emerge is at some point, what enters into the discussion is a further consideration related to possible worlds. Now, given the popularity of the Marvel universe and things like that, we are not talking about parallel worlds where there's a second me existing someplace else in a second world or like a multiverse type thing. We're not talking about that. Possible worlds and the discussions that start to emerge related to this really have to do with what's called middle knowledge originally. At least that's the early form of it. And middle knowledge refers to basically this hypothetical knowledge that God has. So the reason it was called middle is because in the medieval scholastics, there was this talk of God's necessary knowledge, and this would be reflective of realism, the idea that God necessarily knows like mathematical truths, for example, things that are, somehow metaphysically necessary or geometrically necessary or something like that. And then on the other side, you have God's free knowledge. And by free, they meant, well, God decides to make a world. He decides to make a world that includes Dr. Jacobs. And so he has free knowledge of Dr. Jacobs, meaning he's made certain choices that ended up producing certain realities. And from those choices emerges the knowledge that he has of me. Now, middle referred to what is essentially a hypothetical knowledge. So part of the question that emerges largely from the Spanish Jesuits, people like Luis de Molina and Suarez, is this entire question of whether or not, well, does God have knowledge that sits between this necessary knowledge and this free knowledge, this middle knowledge that is like, well, he has a hypothetical knowledge that if he were to do this, then this thing would result, And the reason that was significant is because it started to introduce into, theology and specifically Christian theological discourse, this question of whether or not God somehow maybe picks our world out of a whole host of possible worlds that float about in his mind. And this becomes integral to how Leibniz himself ends up defending God in his Theodicy. Now, transparently, I am not an advocate of middle knowledge. I'm not an advocate of possible worlds. And in that sort of middle knowledge sense. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the third episode. And that's because I think the Eastern Church Fathers do not actually advocate this sort of hypothetical knowledge. Just as a quick example, John of Damascus, when answering the question like, why would God make the damned? His answer is he doesn't know they'll be damned before he chooses to make them. Now, that gets very complicated for people because they say, well, hey, does that mean that God doesn't know the future? No, the Eastern Church Fathers think God knows the future, but they think he knows the future because it's the future. In other words, once he decides to make a world, that now that world has a future. Now he knows that. But there is an ordering to God's choosing and God's knowing. God knows the future because he's chosen to make a world that has a future. And so it doesn't come in the reverse order, which is what this sort of hypothetical knowledge does, where somehow God knows a bunch of hypothetical futurities, but they're not grounded in anything real. And then he decides to make something real. So I'm actually not an advocate of middle knowledge. And I think the case is actually, some of these cases on some of these problems related to the problem of evil are much more compelling when you don't have middle knowledge. So I think John of Damascus's answer is a very good answer on why God would make the damned. But suffice it to say that this entire notion of God having hypothetical knowledge, right, hypothetical futurities, possible worlds, things like that, open the door to a new sort of version of the objection, a response, if you will, to the free will defense, which is to say, look, if we grant the possibility, which I don't, but let's just say we do, we grant the possibility that God has knowledge of hypothetical futurities. He has this knowledge of possible worlds. So he knows that if he places me in this situation, I'll sin. And if he places me in this situation, I won't sin. Then the fact of the matter is God has available to him the possibility of sinless worlds, because he can figure out how to precisely orchestrate things to make sure that we free creatures never sin. Shouldn't it mean that there's a bunch of sinless worlds within God's hypothetical knowledge? Now, we'll talk about the sort of metaphysical side of possible worlds and this entire discussion more in our next episode when we're delving into stuff related to Leibniz and the scholastics and things like that. But suffice it to say that Alvin Plantinga, an analytic philosopher, well-known analytic philosopher, in philosophy of religion, has actually tackled this problem and suggested that, it's not obvious that just because God has, available to him knowledge of various possible worlds, that means he has available to him a sinless world. Now, just to be clear, Plantinga's possible worlds are not the same as the scholastics. The scholastics are engaged in an entire metaphysical discussion that we'll touch on, in our next episode. But with Plantinga, he's engaged in a contemporary form of modal logic, right? Modes of being, possible, impossible, contingent, necessary, things like that. He's engaged in a contemporary form of modal logic that utilizes possible worlds. So it's not identical, but nonetheless, his insight is just as relevant if you're doing the metaphysical stuff. So how does he get there, right? How can you actually talk about these various possible worlds representative of various possibilities and somehow suggest that God, might not have available to him a sinless world if it includes free beings, which is exactly what Plantinga wants to argue. Now, Plantinga's case trades on the same sort of metaphysical necessity that you see in the archaic case, namely that the will is self-determining. So let's take a proposition about the future, right? Dr. Jacobs will eat breakfast tomorrow. Okay. And we want to say because I have free will, it is entirely like there's nothing about me that requires that I eat breakfast or I not eat breakfast. Both are logically possible choices. Both are grounded in my own being. I have the capacity to do either one. And so when we're talking about logical possibilities, right, there's the logical possibility that I eat breakfast tomorrow morning. There's the logical possibility that I don't eat breakfast tomorrow morning. Now, we might want to say, well, see, then both are available to God, and God can determine which one he's going to actually bring about. However, when we're talking about a self-determining free being, we have to actually add a predicate. Dr. Jacobs will freely eat breakfast tomorrow, or Dr. Jacobs will freely not eat breakfast tomorrow. And the problem you run into here is that according to the law of excluded middle, one of these is true and the other one is false. In other words, according to the law of excluded middle, a proposition is either true or false. There is no middle. And so when you're talking about this, let's just say that it's true. Dr. Jacobs will freely choose to not eat breakfast tomorrow. That one's true. The question is, can God bring about the alternative that I freely choose to eat breakfast? Well, Plantinga actually answers that the answer is no. And why? Because I actually have to participate, right? It is not unilaterally determined or brought about by God. And so if it's true that I will freely opt to not eat breakfast tomorrow, God might be able to bring about the proposition that I, coercively or not freely eat breakfast tomorrow. But what has been removed from the table is the option of me freely choosing to eat breakfast tomorrow. In other words, what Plantinga is looking to do is he's looking to suggest that the very fact that freedom requires a two-way street, right? It is not just God, but God and the creature. And one of these things is true and one of these things is false, that even in the realm of possible worlds, you end up having the need for the creature to participate. And this is one of the reasons why Plantinga draws a distinction between what he calls logically possible worlds and actualizable worlds. So what this distinction is to say, yes, think about where we started, right? I said, well, is it logically possible that I freely choose to eat breakfast and freely choose to not eat breakfast, right? Either of those is logically possible because it's within my capacity and it's within, the parameters of free will that I can do either one. So not being a determined being, I have the freedom to choose either way. So both are logically possible. Those are properly grounded. There's no inherent contradiction in either one. But in order for God to actualize one of those, he needs to have me cooperate, right? The idea is that because it is not a unilateral act, God just bringing about, a rock that exists or something like that, that would be a unilateral act. Because it's a bilateral act, one in which I need to actually participate because the predicate includes something about me. I freely do that. Then what God needs in order to bring this about is for me to cooperate. And so according to Plantinga, what he actually argues is that if it is true that I will freely choose to not eat breakfast tomorrow, then I have removed from the table, so to speak, the option to actualize the world in which I freely choose to eat breakfast tomorrow. God can only actualize the one where I freely choose to not eat breakfast tomorrow. Or alternatively, like I said, maybe you insert a third proposition that God can choose to make me eat breakfast, but it's not free, right? How that comes about. So this is the sort of thing where that Plantinga uses in order to suggest that not every logically possible world is an actualizable world. And the importance of that is because when you're talking about logical possibilities, yes, a sinless world is a logical possibility. Sure, there is no contradiction in the concept that every free creature from the dawn of creation to the end of the cosmos freely chooses to not sin. But the question is that world available to God? And even when you're introducing possible worlds, what Plantinga wants to suggest is that the scope of what God can actualize or bring about is actually in some ways, because it is, it is a bilateral reality, not a unilateral reality. It requires that the creatures themselves actually cooperate. So it's entirely possible that when God looks out over these possible worlds, what he finds is what Plantinga calls trans-world depravity. The idea that somehow every possible world involving free creatures that is available to God, the creatures of that world choose to sin. And it's not that a sinless world is necessary, right? It's logically possible that those creatures not sin. But if they chose sin, then the only version of that world available to God is the one where they sin. And incidentally, I'm going to argue when we get to Leibniz, I actually suggest something's very similar with Leibniz. I actually do think there is some sense to this. So while I'm not an advocate of possible worlds, I do think that even if there were possible worlds, the scope of possible worlds is not just every logical possibility. Insofar as possible worlds include creatures, just like the real world requires some sort of act by us, so possible worlds are in some ways limited in scope by what we freely choose. And so in this sense, I'm not convinced that even with a possible worlds theory, just like Plantinga argues, that a sinless world is available to God. It's entirely possible that God, being omnipotent, still cannot bring about a world without sin. Now, I think there is also a legitimate question which Leibniz himself raises, which is it's rather presumptuous to suggest that the sinless world is better than a world with sin. Now, that might sound outrageous because it just seems obvious. Like, obviously, you want the world without sin if one of those is available to God. If God could bring about a sinless world, then that's the preferable world. But it's not actually obvious. And here's one of the ways in which you can see that rather quickly. Could God make a world without sin? Well, sure. If he made a world of all rocks, okay? A world of all rocks would indeed be a sinless world. Why? Well, because there are no moral agents in that world. So the fact of the matter is moral properties require the sorts of conditions of culpability talked about. You need to have beings who know what they ought to do and have the capacity to do it or not do it. That's where the moral properties and praise and blame, those are based on those conditions. So if you have a world full of beings who are not moral beings, then you would have a sinless world. But it's not obvious that that world is better than ours. In fact, I think what's quite obvious is a world of all rocks is inferior to our world, even though our world has sin in it. And this is one of the points that Leibniz makes. He's not, even though he thinks it's, we very quickly jump to the conclusion that if there's a sinless option, then that option is preferable to ours. He suggests, I don't know that that's actually true, right? Our all rock world is a sinless world, but it's pretty deficient, compared to our own. And something that other philosophers of religion have rightly pointed out, and you can find in Leibniz as well, is the idea that there are certain complex goods that adhere to our world that unfortunately enmesh with evils. So, for example, forgiveness. Forgiveness is a good, right? Redemption. Redemption is a good. Mercy. Mercy is a good, right? Like these sorts of things. Charity. Charity is a good. These sorts of things are genuine goods, but they're goods that cannot exist in a world where there has not been some amount of evil. And this is kind of the problem. This is where you get into what's called complex goods. So there are certain goods that are simple, right? They're straightforward. They're just good in themselves. But when you get into these things that are entangled with other things, you start to get to a complex good. So forgiveness, of course, requires something to be forgiven. So we can be moved, right? Some of the stories that move us most are stories that involve reconciliation, stories that involve redemption, stories that involve growth and change, right? In fact, any story that doesn't involve that sort of trajectory is one that is rather boring. And part of the problem is that those goods, right? Goods like forgiveness, like mercy, like reconciliation, right? Like charity and things like that, they just go away in a world where there is never any sort of, corruption, where there is never any sort of sin. Now, of course, the complexity here is that you don't want to be the one who occasions forgiveness, right? This doesn't mean that you should go out and sin so that you can be forgiven. It doesn't mean you should go out and, rob people so that they are in need and therefore people can show them charity, right? You don't want to use that in that sort of sense. But the problem is that what you're looking at is when you look at the fact that there are complex goods that enmesh with certain evils, it's not so obvious that if you remove from the story of our world all of those, that you actually do have a better world. And this is an important point. This is the sort of thing you find in people like Richard Swinburne in contemporary way. And as I said, you can find it in Leibniz as well. And this gets to the second prong of the sort of traditional Christian defense of God in the face of evil. And that is what is called the permissive will of God. So as I said, like when we talked about the nature of evil, that was really sort of, I suppose that's really the first prong, is that evil is a privation. The second prong, I guess, would be the free will defense. So maybe we're in the third prong now here. But as mentioned in the entire point in saying, that evil is a privation, the whole point was to say God is not the cause of it. He doesn't create it. He doesn't bring it about. We bring it about. And that's a critical feature of Christian thinking. But this also then factors into how Christians have always thought about the permissive will of God. It's critical that we never think of God as a utilitarian, right? So utilitarians tend to be the ones who say, like, look, how we adjudicate good and evil, which incidentally, they don't really mean good and evil, they mean pleasure and pain. But how we quantify good and evil is really just like whether or not at the end of the day we get quantifiably more good than evil out of it. And if we do, then whatever evil we might perpetrate to get there is justified, right? This is what people then, concisely summarize as the ends justify the means, right? That sort of thing. And Christianity has always rejected the idea that God's permissive will is utilitarian, that somehow God looks out and says, you know what, the world would be a much better place if we had evil, so I'm going to cause evil in order to bring about a better world. That's never been the Christian concept. Instead, the Christian concept of the permissive will of God is much more nuanced. The concept ends up being formalized by John of Damascus in particular, this 8th century church father. But conceptually, you can find it before him. You can find it like, for example, what John describes. You can find it, all of the Christians talk about the permissive will of God, that he permits and he doesn't cause evil and things like that. But the specific things I'm going to talk about with John of Damascus is you can find conceptually in people like John Chrysostom, his homilies on Ephesians, for example, before you ever get the formalized terms with John of Damascus. But John of Damascus ends up drawing a distinction between what he calls the antecedent will of God and the consequent will of God. And this is in order to help illuminate what it means that God permits evils, though he does not will them. And so what is this, right? The antecedent will goes to a commitment from the Christians that suggests that God is good, right? And as I touched on, with Plato, right, God is the good, right? So you have this concept that suggests that like God is not just like he prefers goodness or something like that. He is the good, right? This is who he is, right? He is the good. And so with that, what you end up having is that is not an ambiguous term. Right? It's not ambiguous what it means to say that God is good. And it's not actually, reverse engineering. Like if God, decides to torture infants for fun, that's good because God chose to do it. It's never been that sort of thing. It's actually a very clearly defined concept in the ancient world. That goodness means you desire the good of the other, right? And think of what I had said about ontology. So I talked about the good of the eye is to see, right? The idea that every being has innate teleology, a proper formation. It has a nature that is supposed to move into proper formation and has a teleological end, right? And so physical causes are a good example of this, right? The eye for seeing, the ear for hearing. You can look at plants, right? The leaves for photosynthesis and things like that. And so you have a certain nature of a thing, a leaf, that has a final cause, a teleological end, photosynthesis. That's not that easy to say. Anyway, but the idea is that that the proper formation ends up yielding its proper function, just like in the case of the eye, right? That what it is an eye, its purpose is to see. When it's properly formed, then it actually is, it performs that function properly. And so the idea was always that what it means to say that God is good, it means that he desires the good of the thing. He desires and wills that the thing become, right, properly formed and fulfill its teleological end. That's redundant. Telos is end, right? Teleological end. But anyway, that it ends up, fulfilling its purpose, right? Fulfilling its end. And so what it meant to talk about divine providence was actually to talk about the idea that God, being the good and the source of all things, moves all things into being and moves them toward proper formation and toward their end. And for this reason, the Christians actually always rejected the idea, especially the Eastern Christians. They always rejected the idea that God might will the evil of a thing, right? That he wills evil for it. Instead, he wills its good, a metaphysical necessity. You can do no other. And so this is what it means to talk about God being good. Now, applied to the will of God, then, this is what John of Damascus has in view when he starts to talk about the antecedent will of God. His idea, what it means is to suggest that any good we might name, God wills, right? He inclines toward it. He wills to the extent that it is good. And any evil we might name, he wills not or repels or recoils from to the degree that it lacks goodness. I say lacks goodness because remember, evil is a privation. And so John of Damascus suggests that there's no mystery about the antecedent will of God. If you ask, like, does God want people to be saved? Like, yes. Does he want, sickness and evils to befall us? No, right? Does he want us to obey the law and function in a way that is good and loving and just and right and all these sorts of things? Of course he does, right? And whatever good you might name, God wills it to the degree it is good. And any evil we might name, right? Disease, cancer, moral evil, physical evil, whatever it is, God wills not or repels. And so John of Damascus suggests that is just a fact about the nature of God and the will of God. But what John of Damascus also points out is that the fact of the matter is our world is complex. And so we run into the situation where there are certain goods that exclude each other, right? Goods that cannot be willed simultaneously. I mean, just think, for example, in our own lives, we run into this all the time. You're laying around and you're feeling relaxed, and that rest and relaxation is a good. But you think to yourself, I should get up and exercise. But, and that is good, but it's in conflict with the sort of rest and ease that you're experiencing. You have to pick one or the other. You can't have both simultaneously. The good of the monastic life might be one thing, right? But the good of marriage is a different thing. You can't have both. You actually have to choose. And so these are what are called, to use later, Leibniz's terminology, these are incompossible, right? These are two goods that can't actually be wed together. You have to actually choose between them. And so John of Damascus suggests that the antecedent will of God wills every good we might name, but the problem is in the consequent will, God faces choices between competing goods. Also, one of the things that he points out is that certain evils enmesh with other goods. So we already talked about this, right? Think about the complex goods we mentioned of forgiveness or mercy or redemption or something like that. Those complex goods end up enmeshing with evils. So the problem is that let's talk about the good of forgiveness. Well, it occasions some sort of transgression or some sort of, infraction or harm or something like that to be forgiven. Well, the fact of the matter is, considering whatever that evil is, God wills it not. But does God will forgiveness? Yes, he does, right? And so those two things end up intertwined. And so John of Damascus's point is that he suggests that even though we very simplistically talk about good and evil, and we can truly and simplistically say that God wills the good and rejects evil, the problem is our world is a complex web of intertwined goods and evils, as well as goods that exclude other goods, right? So once you get into this sort of complex network of choices, now you're into the consequent will of God. Maybe an illustration might help. So let's take, for example, we'll use one example that comes out of Leibniz. Like Leibniz uses this analogy where he suggests, well, imagine that there's a guard and he is posted to keep watch over this town. And he knows an invasion is coming. He knows it's coming that night. It's coming at some point. The invaders are going to come to try to sack this town. But then he also gets word that down in the bar below, there are two men who are getting drunk, who he knows hate each other and want to murder each other. And so he knows if he doesn't intervene, more likely than not, those two guys are going to kill each other. But he also knows if he goes down there to stop that, he leaves the town vulnerable, and it's entirely possible that the town ends up sacked, right? That the invaders come while he's away from his post and he can't warn the village and all the rest. Leibniz actually suggests, he's like, look, even though the guard wills both things, he wills to protect the town, he wills that those two men do not kill each other, right? He repels that evil, he wills the good that they do not kill each other, he wills the good to intervene. The fact of the matter is that those two things are incompatible. He actually has to choose. And so even though the guard will choose, right, to perform his duty because there are more lives at stake and all the rest, to stay at his post and protect the town from the invaders, and in this sense permit the death of one of the two men down in the bar, he doesn't actually will it, right? And so in this sense, this becomes an illustration of the permissive will of God. In other words, though God does not will that evil, or we're using our guard, right? Though the guard does not will the evil and in fact repels it and would intervene, it's not compatible with the other thing that he has to do, which is to protect the town. And that's where you get into that sort of complex web that John of Damascus refers to as the consequent will of God, which is the exact term that Leibniz picks up on and credits John of Damascus for, because he knows that's where it comes from. We might do it another way. Let's consider a biblical example. So one of these stories that in the Old Testament oftentimes people are disturbed by because they look at it and they see a diabolical God who is very unjust is the story of Pharaoh, right? And so when you look at the story of Moses and of Pharaoh, one of the things that people are troubled by is it seems that God is saying that he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart. In fact, he does say he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And in the story, sometimes the way people read this is it sounds like what's happening is God is showing up and he's going to tell Pharaoh to do something. Let my people go. But then he hardens Pharaoh's heart so that he won't let them go, so that he can punish Pharaoh for doing this thing that he's done wrong. And in this sense, what it looks like a very unjust scenario. It looks like Pharaoh doesn't have a choice, right? It looks like Pharaoh, and this goes to the conditions of culpability that we talked about. It looks like what's going on is that God is making Pharaoh disobey so that he can punish Pharaoh for disobeying, right? Which is obviously unjust. Now, the way in which that's always been read in the Eastern Church Fathers, you can find this, for example, in Origen's orations on prayer, and then I believe it also, yes, it's echoed, basically by extension by people like Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus in their Philokalia of Origen. What they end up suggesting is that when God says, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart, what he's actually suggesting, he's not talking about, I'm going to make Pharaoh disobey and then punish him for disobeying. What God is really suggesting is he says, look, I know this man. I know that he is prideful. I know that he thinks he's God. He does think he's a God. And when I show up and I tell him I'm the real God, that pride he is going to harden and he is going to crack. And he's going to say no. And he's going to be stubborn. And he's going to be stubborn to the point that even with plagues that are decimating Egypt, he's still going to keep saying no, right? In other words, God is not forcing Pharaoh to disobey. What he's merely acknowledging is, I know this man, right? What's going to harden Pharaoh's heart is me showing up. And this is where what the Eastern Church Fathers point out in the story of Moses and Pharaoh is a contrast, that God treats the two of them identically. God shows up, he declares who he is, he demonstrates it by miracle, and he makes a demand. And in the case of Moses, who is receptive, good soil, he ends up becoming a saint. But in the case of Pharaoh, he becomes hardened and cracked and ultimately is destroyed. Now, what's interesting here is you say, well, what is God's disposition toward Pharaoh? Well, according to the Eastern Church Fathers, keep in mind what we said about divine goodness and divine providence. God desires, yes, even Pharaoh's salvation. He desires the salvation of all. Why? Because he is good. And he must, for that reason, he can do no other than desire the good of the being. And in the case of man, that means to know and love God, right? The very things that are talked about in salvation, right? For us to be made into what we are really created to be, that is our good. And God desires it for me. He desires it for you. He wills it for me. He wills it for you. And he wills it for Pharaoh. And in this sense, God not showing up would be an act of mercy, because God knows that showing up and talking to Pharaoh will end up causing Pharaoh to harden and crack. But the problem is, the situation is a complex good. Why? Pharaoh is oppressing God's people, and he also wants them to be released. He wants the redemption narrative that's going to unfold into the birth of the Christ and the redemption of humanity. So God's duty to his people, to his covenant that he made with the patriarchs, to all of humanity to bring about salvation means that God cannot, out of love and compassion for Pharaoh, forego those duties. He must still show up and declare who he is and tell Pharaoh to let his people go, even though he knows that the result is that Pharaoh will harden and crack. That is what John of Damascus has in mind with the consequent will of God, meaning antecedently, yes, God desires the good of Pharaoh, and antecedently, God wills to show Pharaoh mercy. And none of that desire in God changes. But consequently, God can't put the good of Pharaoh above the good of the people and the rest of humanity. And so in his consequent will, he permits the destruction of Pharaoh by making himself known to him. And that right there is the Christian picture of divine permission, right? That God permits evil, though he does not will it, right? So this is contrary to the sort of utilitarian notion. Oftentimes people project this on Leibniz, and Leibniz is really clear. He's like, I don't hold to that view. Some people want to suggest that somehow God's looking out and he's just looking at the broad tapestry, and we just become, faceless data points that sort of are subject to his will or something like that. He has some larger scheme that he's doing, and he disregards or doesn't care about us. Whereas the permissive will of God, as illustrated, as understood by the Christians, is entirely contrary to that. That God is deeply concerned with your good and with my good, and at every turn, that never changes. Even if the grander scheme of things requires the permitting of certain evils, that never goes away. It never changes. And that really gets us sort of to the last prong of what is the sort of standard, sort of staple of the Christian response to the problem of evil, which is considering the entire story. So we had started with the entire notion that evil is not a substance. So God doesn't create it, right? It's a privation or it's a twisting or something like that. We move from that into the free will defense, where the entire idea is that not even God can make free creatures that are not self-determining. And that self-determination means that some part of the formation of the world depends upon us. And not even God can make it otherwise, not if he's going to make free rational beings. And so for that reason, when the twisting and the distortion of the world comes into play, it originates not with him, but with us. And from there, we got to the permissive will of God. Like, why is it that God would permit free beings to perform evil? And obviously, part of the answer is that, when you make free beings, they are self-determining. So it's sort of a metaphysical entailment of making that type of being. But then we also saw is when you're talking about the antecedent and consequent will of God, the fact of the matter is that the divine duties, right, the divine will is exceedingly complex, because even though God wills every good and repels every evil, the fact of the matter is that our world is exceedingly complex. And so the consequent will of God deals in these complexities where we are part of a world where not every good is compatible and where certain evils enmesh with certain goods. And so God might find himself forgoing a good that he wills and permitting an evil that he wills not. Even though he wills the good of Pharaoh and he wills the good of the people of Israel and he wills the redemption of humanity, not all of those things are compatible, because showing mercy on Pharaoh would mean to not show up. It would mean to leave the people of Israel in bondage. It would mean to not carry out the redemption story that brings about the redemption of humanity, the birth of Christ, all of that sort of stuff. So even though he wills the good of Pharaoh, he needs to forego that and permit Pharaoh's destruction in order to bring about these other goods. That's the nature of that complexity. And in fact, free will itself is the quintessential example of this. It is a good that our world involves rational beings who are intelligent and free. But that good is enmeshed with the possibility of them corrupting themselves and the world of which they are part. And so at the end of the day, even though God wills that we not sin, he must permit it if he wants to bring about a world filled with beings like us who are rational and free. But as I said, the last prong of this that comes up again and again in traditional Christian defenses is the entire story. And I do think this is an important point to keep in mind. According to the Christian narrative, the story that we tend to point to, where we identify all the different evils that surround us, is only a small sliver of the entire story, right? According to the story that we've been told, right, the one that we're looking at when we're talking about Christianity, ultimately there will be a point at which all people are called to account. There will be a point where the righteous are rewarded, the wicked are punished, all things are set right, creation is made new. And that actually marks the rest of the story that endures for much, much longer. And Christianity has always pointed out that this time right now and the evils we experience here and now are exceedingly transient, right? They are exceedingly temporal. And also important to that is the idea that those transient realities, those trials and those sufferings, ultimately, when put in the light of eternity and have it, paired with a right understanding of the world, are purposive, that they're redemptive. This is something that comes up time and again with the saints. The idea that the saints undergo sufferings because they believe that those sufferings have purpose in the sense of forming them, of purging them, of purifying them, and then setting them right in terms of their relationship to God. And in this sense, they end up rewarded, right? It ends up being the sort of crucible that they run through that has on the other side of it some sort of reward that is worthwhile. So there's this story about Elder Paisios, Saint Paisios, a monk, a 20th century monk, who's deeply beloved in the Orthodox Church. And he was visited by Saint Catherine, who was tortured severely and martyred for her faith. And one of the things that Elder Paisios, when he was talking with her, he asked, how on earth did you endure the sort of things that they subjugated you to? And her response was essentially, well, if I understood the glory that was set before me, if I understood the reward that would come from that, I would have asked for more. And, he marvels at that. But that's not an unusual sentiment to find amongst the saints. And this is a critical feature of the Christian worldview. So often, the sorts of things that we talk about, when you look at the objectors, right, those who level the objection of the problem of evil or talk about certain pain or suffering or animal pain or whatever, part of it is that it's a very this worldly sort of perspective. They paint a complete narrative that has no purpose to it, right? Here is an example of purposeless suffering or purposeless evil or unredeemed evil or something like that. But the problem is that under the Christian narrative, and this is why this has always been an important staple of its defense, if the narrative is true, right, if we're exploring whether or not the Christian narrative can actually survive this sort of critique, an important part of the narrative is the fact that at some point the dead will be raised, all will be called to account. The righteous will be rewarded, the wicked will be punished, all things will be made new, the world will be set in order, things will finally be just and fair and right, every tear will be wiped away, and all will be well. And so that's an important part of the story, to somehow take just a sliver of it and see, it's purposeless, right? You could do that with St. Catherine. You could sit here and just say, well, look at this person who wasted their life, right? They were pious, and at some point they end up tortured for the things they believe, and they just die, and that's the end of it. But if the Christian narrative is true, right, if St. Catherine on the other side of that ended up attaining the proper end for which humanity is made, she ended up becoming a saint. She ended up experiencing, union with God and the love of God and the sort of goods that come from salvation, and ultimately is rewarded, and such that, every tear is wiped away, and she wishes she only had experienced more because she recognizes the goods that have come from it, the complex goods, complex no doubt, the complex goods that come from it. Then that's an important part of the assessment of that particular evil, the evil of her being tortured, because ultimately it is really part of a complex good, ultimately her salvation, her testimony, and all the rest. And so this is one of the reasons why Christianity has always objected that the opponent, right, the one who identifies evil and pain and suffering as purposeless and so on, has a very myopic picture. They're looking at only a sliver of the story. They're stuck in chapter 1, as it were, and they haven't considered the entire story arc. They haven't looked at how things ultimately pan out. And we'll talk more in detail about this. I mean, for example, even with the story of Pharaoh, just by way of a teaser, I'll just say that the Eastern Church Fathers don't think Pharaoh's story is over when he drowns. And so even though there is a complexity there, right, God permitting the destruction of Pharaoh, it's not as if God abandons and gives up on Pharaoh just because he was drowned. So the consideration of the whole of the narrative, the entire story, is also an important part of the assessment of the problem of evil. So we'll end there this episode. I think we actually made it through it, right? The sort of main components of the Christian, the traditional defense response to the problem of evil, right? Evil is a privation, the free will defense, the permissive will of God, and the consideration of the entire narrative. Next time, we will delve into some of the more metaphysically robust considerations from, ancient and medieval thought, as well as the sorts of things raised by Leibniz. And then finally, episode 3, we'll go ahead and we'll jump into what is it that we can learn uniquely from the Eastern Church Fathers. So looking forward to next time. With that, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell, and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.